Good morning, Mr. Arlinghouse. Today is Wednesday, March the 24th. And today we are going to try and finish this unit with the anticipation that perhaps we can have our next test on Monday because we still have a lot of ground to cover. And so let's get right into it. Actually, before we get into it, I wanted to show you something, Mr. Arlinghouse, that you might find interesting. This is one of the Faberge eggs. If you notice, that's pictures of various Russian czars. The Faberge egg was a gift, a wedding gift from Tsar Nicholas II to his bride, his German bride, Alexandria. Yes, Alexandria. And so, yeah, I just think that's interesting. I mean, so if you're wondering why the Czar had compiled a lot of debt, this didn't help. Because, nothing in this is anything but gold or precious stones. And so with that, let us go back to here. Thank you. So, actually, let's go here. And let's begin talking about the peace process after World War I. Modern European history, and I've said this before, pays a lot of attention to the buildup of World War I. A lot of attention to the results of the war, how the war was settled out, how Europe, the face of Europe, was changed. A lot of attention to that because, World War I is really a watershed. It really sets Europe for the next century. So, I mean, and I know I've talked about this before. Many of the Eastern European countries, Mr. Arlinghouse, were founded in 1918 as a result of World War I. I told you I was there in 2018 in Poland, which was founded in 1918, Czech Republic, and Hungary, all of which. And I also went through Slovakia, and all those countries counted that as their centennial year. I didn't see any big celebrations, except for the one museum I went to there in Budapest. So, the Treaty of Versailles. Once again, Versailles, the beautiful palace of Louis XIV. The Treaty of Versailles consisted of 5 separate treaties between the victors and the defeated nations. Actually, more like a deal. The Treaty of Versailles is often looked upon as one of the great mistakes of Western European history. So, Woodrow Wilson arrived at the conference. In fact, when Wilson showed up, there was a big parade and lots of Parisians lined the streets, and there was great anticipation that the American was going to come and he was going to make everything all good, which of course made the French president, whose name I can't remember now, and the English Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, most unhappy, jealous, and they kind of just chuckled at themselves because, here comes this cowboy, and he thinks he's going to change stuff. I mean, there was, when the Americans showed up, of course, the Americans came in like, hey, we won the war. And the British and French were like, hey, thanks for showing up late. Anyway, so Wilson arrived at the conference with much acclaim and optimism that he would provide a new international order and would bring justice, peace, and there's that word again, self-determination. I like that word, and my students better know what that is. Yes, self-determination, the idea that every ethnicity should have its own country. And, aside from the picture of the statue I showed you, I mean, in 1919, you would go around to little hovels, little humble homes in Eastern Europe, and above their fireplace, you'd find, tacked up there would be a picture taken from a newspaper or a magazine of the American president, Woodrow Wilson. Anyway, I think that I went over the 4 ideas of the Treaty of Versailles. Yeah, his 14 points. Did I not do that? I thought I had it here, Mr. Arlinghouse. The 14 points. So why don't we write those down, Mr. Arlinghouse? Can you remember the 14 points? Let's do that. I can't believe I didn't have them. So let's do the 14 points, shall we? And here they are. Yes. And first of all, let's get rid of that. Thank you. What, you think I'm going to write out all 14? Can't do that. Not even Coke Zero can make me do that, Mr. Arlinghouse. So I summarized them into 4. Okay. Number 1. Open covenants openly arrived at. What does that mean? It means no more secret deals. No more, negotiating in secret and then, not telling anybody else. And the problem with secret deals is a couple things. Number one, the rest of the world is not aware that a treaty has been struck between 2 countries. But also, secret deals are easy to break. And when they're broken, it causes a lot of consternation, such as the secret deals worked out, for example, between Austria and Russia over the Dardanelles. Austria got what it wanted, that being Bosnia-Herzegovina, and Russia got faced. Yeah. 2. Freedom of trade and navigation. This was taken largely from the trade rivalry that existed in China. I mean, the European countries and Japan were like at each other's throats, seeing who would get the advantage in trading in China. 3, and this is what Wilson was known for, self-determination. And 4, Woodrow Wilson proposed this thing called the League of Nations, a international Congress. I mean, Woodrow Wilson was. I'm not a fan of Woodrow Wilson. Once again, even though he was the president who was responsible for giving women the vote in this country, he supported that, which probably pushed it over the top. He was also a racist. And also, the man was just cowboy naive. I mean, he actually went to this conference, and when people would tell him things, he would believe them. He didn't think people would lie. Not to him. He saw the world in very simple terms. And so he believed that if you created a international Congress, where every nation would be a member, and when there was a big decision to be made, you would vote on it. He was such a believer in democracy. He thought that would settle all issues. The plan had merit, definitely. A place where you would bring differences to the peace table, to the conference table, rather than duking it out, going to war, that kind of thing. And that organization was going to be called the League of Nations. Okay, League of Nations. And Woodrow Wilson put all kind of faith. In fact, spoiler alert, Mr. Arlinghouse, spoiler alert, the first 13, or rather the first 3 I have listed here, they get blown up. Yeah, the French president, he kept saying, 14 points, 14 points. I am so tired of hearing for 14 points. Mr. President, did you not know that God only had 10? And he was being funny, of course, referring to the 10 Commandments, Mr. Arlinghouse. Point of the matter was, of the 14 points, 13 of them got shot down, but the one that did get passed was this League of Nations. Wilson figured that, if I can get that passed, then we can work out the rest. Naive man he was. So, as it says there, open covenants openly arrived at quickly gave way to cynicism amongst the victors. Britain and France. Britain and France wanted payback. Payback in terms of territory from the Germans, payback in terms of humiliation, and payback in terms of money. The Wilson's idea of peace without victors soon became a mockery when Germany and Russia were excluded from their own peace settlements. Germany and Russia were not even invited. I mean, two of the biggest, most important countries in the world were not invited to the deliberations over the Treaty of Versailles. The Germans were handed a deal and expected to sign it, and it was a bad deal. Very disadvantageous to the Germans, very harsh and brutal to the Germans, particularly Article 237, I think it is. I always get confused, Mr. Arlinghouse. You'll tell me, won't you? Is it Article 231, which is also the name of the main highway in my county, or was it Article 237? I can never remember. At any rate, the article was the war guilt clause. Basically, Germany had to sign a document saying that this great war that we just endured, 4 years of misery, these 4 years of misery was completely and totally the fault of Germany, and that anything that happens to Germany from this point on is Germany's fault. In other words, Germany deserves what is about to be handed to it. An ugly deal. And they had to sign that. You say, well, what if they didn't sign it? Well, the war goes on. And by that time, the Germans had laid down their arms. They had went back home. The armistice had been signed, and Germany was in no shape to carry on. The Allies, with the Americans there, still, could have dealt out. They could have made things really bad for Germany. Germany needed to quit more than anybody else. So, national self-determination was cast aside in favor of practicality and cynicism. So a lot of these ideas, a lot of these small ethnic groups were totally disregarded. Lots of them. Not limited to, but including Indian nationalism, South African nationalism, Vietnamese nationalism. All those people came to the conference wanting to get heard because they had sent soldiers to World War I. The Japanese got cheated. Japanese got into World War I, Mr. Arlinghouse, thinking that it would expand their empire. And they fought the Germans in the Pacific. They spilled Japanese blood, spilled Japanese treasure. And then, after the war was over with, the British and French said, those islands you took, you can't keep them, but we'll take care of them. So, Wilson went from hero to goat, as he had to abandon, not goat in the sense that you're the goat, Mr. Arlinghouse. Not the greatest of all time, but the other kind of goat. Wilson went from hero to goat as he had to abandon each one of his ideas in the face of practicality. Woodrow Wilson put great faith in this idea for the League of Nations, which he felt would solve all the problems left over by the treaty, and there were lots of them, Mr. Arlinghouse. The League was not to be an international government, but a body of sovereign states that agreed to pursue common policies and to consult. Basically, sit down and talk versus shooting each other in the common interest, especially when war threatened. Refusal to abide by any of the members would mean economic sanctions and perhaps even military intervention. The League, of course, had many problems. Number one, it had no military forces at its disposal. And like, for example, the United Nations, which is what we put together, what the countries put together after World War II, it actually does have a peacekeeping force. The League of Nations did not. Yes, the United Nations has what is called the Blue Helmets. The purpose of UN soldiers is not necessarily to uh, take military action, although they have done that in the past. The purpose of UN soldiers, which is why they have blue helmets and their armored cars and vehicles are all painted white, they want to be seen. And so that any action you take against them, you know, is no mistake. Anyway, any such action would require, though, a unanimous consent of its council, of its so-called Security Council. Why did I not write that in there? Security Council, which consisted permanently of Britain, France, Japan, Italy, and the United States, as well as 4 temporary members. The Covenant of the League bound its members to respect and preserve the territorial integrity of all of its members, which was generally seen as a directive to preserve what had been won by the victor nations, meaning that all the land that the victor nations had been able to conquer, they got to keep. The exclusion of Germany and, there you look, I used the word Soviet Union. And Soviet Union, although the word Soviet Union is not really born until 1922, but the exclusion of these two from the League could also undermine its claim to even-handedness and credibility. Now, let's talk a little bit, before we push on, let's talk a little bit, Mr. Arlinghouse, about Woodrow Wilson before we say goodbye to him, because we're about to. So Woodrow Wilson goes to Paris, and, he has his 14 points. And, the 14 points are pretty much shot down except for the League of Nations. But here's the peace treaty. And the Woodrow Wilson takes the peace treaty back to the United States. And if you know anything about government, which I'm sure you do, Mr. Arlinghouse, if you know anything about the way government works, the president, yes, signs treaties. But those treaties do not become binding upon the United States unless they are approved by a 2/3 majority of the Senate. He has to run, the Senate, not the Congress, the Senate. One of the most powerful committees in the Senate is the Foreign Relations Committee. They're the ones who, run such treaties through the United States Senate and give their recommendations. So Woodrow Wilson takes the treaty, as well as membership in the League of Nations, back to the United States Senate and says, hey, look what I did. Now you guys sign this. Well, the mood of the United States, literally immediately after the war, after seeing all these boys come home in pieces or not at all, after, the disillusionment, the press got a hold of what the victor nations were doing, the unfairness of the Treaty of Versailles. And, they publish it in the newspaper every day. And so Woodrow Wilson shows up in the Senate with the Treaty of Versailles and with the application to join the League of Nations. And the Senate totally, both of them, totally thumbs down. And here's the interesting thing. So Woodrow Wilson's like, I want this. We need this. This is a good thing. And so what Woodrow Wilson does, Mr. Arlinghouse, he says, I'm going to take my case for the Treaty of Versailles directly to the people. And before Air Force One, Mr. Arlinghouse, the president traveled around the country, obviously by train. And the train, believe it or not, was called the Ferdinand Magellan. Ferdinand Magellan was a bulletproof train. Not kidding. Had bulletproof cars in it that the president, would ride around on. And so the president begins this nationwide tour, preaching the virtues of the Treaty of Versailles, preaching the virtues of, membership in the League of Nations. And, he goes, and this, you got to remember, Woodrow Wilson's not a young man. And the pressures of the presidency are really wearing on him, and he becomes ill. And I think he was in Colorado. I'm not sure, but I think. And in the middle of this campaign, and he suffered a massive stroke. And so the tour was ended, and they took the president back to Washington, D.C., and then, of course, to the White House, where he was cared for by the best doctors they could find. And here's the thing. So he had a stroke, and for the longest, in fact, for the rest of Wilson's term, no one was allowed to see the president, except, of course, for, I forget what his wife. And by the way, this was his second wife. His first wife had died, except for his wife, and of course, very, 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 very close attaches. And here's the thing, though, Mr. Arlinghouse, the president still, even though he's laid up, still has to function, still has to, he's alive, he's not dead, he still has to exercise the duties of the presidential office, sign executive orders, et cetera, et cetera. And so what would happen is those executive orders would be brought to the president, to the West Wing of the White House, and, into the personal chambers, and Mrs. Wilson would take them into him, and then those orders would come out signed or unsigned or whatever. Here's the thing, though. Wilson never recovered from this stroke. Many historians believe, especially with the change of the signatures of the president, many historians believe that this country was being ran in the last few weeks of Wilson's term, not by Woodrow Wilson, but by his wife, who acted as president and kept it all a secret. Now, regarding the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations, the United States never signed, never approved, never ratified the Treaty of Versailles. In fact, in 1922, the United States and Germany signed a separate peace in 1922. The League of Nations, the United States never joined, which was one of the reasons for its failure. It will fail. It's going to last about 13, 14, 15 years. I don't know exactly how long it's talking about, but it will fail. But, yeah, interesting story, no? So let's push on. Roman numeral 28. The colonial empires also played a large role in the negotiations. These areas were called mandates. In other words, it's basically another word for colony that the British and French took over and were placed under the tutelage of one of the great powers, particularly France and Britain. And the idea was, or at least the profession was, they were supposed to guide these former colonies toward independence. Yeah, the British and French were not about giving these third world peoples independence. The movements toward disarmament were also very weak. Members of the League, I should capitalize that. Members of the League remained fully sovereign and continued to pursue their own national interests, which meant for the British and French keep pumping up the arms race. Wilson makes me think of volleyball, doesn't it? You, Mr. Arlinghouse? In order to get the others to accept the League, also accepted the territorial settlements. That, he did it. It violated his own principles. Wilson said, "Okay, you, Britain and France, you can have the Middle East," which is basically what they did. Britain and France basically divided the oil-rich Middle East between the two of them. And Wilson said, all right, but it really galled Wilson. So, Roman 29. In the West, the main territorial concern was the fate of Germany. No one gave serious consideration of splitting Germany again, which they will, as you know, Mr. Arlinghouse, after World War II, but nobody gave consideration to it here. The French wanted an independent Rhineland. The Rhineland is a region on the eastern side of the Rhine River, very rich in coal and iron deposits. But Lloyd George British Prime Minister, and Wilson would not hear of it. The French received, look, there it is, they got it back. The French got back the Alsace-Lorraine region and also received the right to work the coal mines of the Saar for 15 years. The Saar is, once again, a heavy industrialized district in Germany. So France not only got back this Alsace-Lorraine, which they lost in the Franco-Prussian War, but they also got the right to harvest coal out of the Saar for the next 15 years, and coal was the backbone of industry. Germany west of the Rhineland, plus another 50 miles, was to be a demilitarized zone. But Allied troops could stay on the west bank of the Rhine River for 15 years. These details are important. It's always good to know such things. I'm not going to ask you for that on a test, but at the same time, you basically all of this is just showing you, the thumb screws they put Germany under. Britain and the United States guaranteed to help France if the Germans attacked. Germany, however, was disarmed, theoretically, at least permanently. Theoretically. Germany's army was reduced to 100,000 men on long-term service. I mean, that's a fraction of what they had, a peacetime German army prior to World War I. Its naval fleet was reduced to a coastal defense force. All those fine, heavy battleships scuttled. It was also forbidden to have warplanes, submarines, tanks. You're welcome. I'm so funny. Tanks, heavy artillery, or, of course, poison gas. Which leads us to an interesting point. Poison gas. There's a thing called the Geneva Convention of War, Mr. Arlinghouse, where the use of poison gas was outlawed. Now, this is interesting, Mr. Arlinghouse. The Geneva Convention of War, I think the year was 1925, where the use of poison gas was outlawed by international law. And the United States signed that agreement, the use of poisonous gas was outlawed, but the possession of poisonous gas was not. How do I know? Well, Mr. Arlinghouse, one day we should get in my car and drive down to Lexington, get on 64 heading east, and in the little town of Winchester, that's right, Winchester, where they make Ale 8, nasty stuff. But in the town of Winchester, they have this giant army depot that has tons and tons of poison gas in rusting canisters. And if I know that, Mr. Arlinghouse, lots of people know that. All right, so the settlement of Eastern Europe reflected the collapse of the great defeated empires, the Russian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Austrian Empire, and the German Empire that had dominated Eastern Europe for centuries. Germany lost part of Silesia, and East Prussia was cut off from the rest of Germany by the Polish corridor. I'm going to have to go to a map, Mr. Arlinghouse. We've got to look at this, so give me a second. Yes, and we're back, Mr. Arlinghouse. Now let's go have a look at that map, shall we? After we go here, yes. Want to look at that map, okay? Not this one, yes. All right, so this is what Europe looks like after World War I. Notice a couple of things. There are many things to notice. So yeah, do a mental photograph or, click on this picture, save it for yourself, whatever. But first of all, look at Germany. Germany used to extend all the way out here. Now, one of the big changes was the breakup of Germany, or the German Empire, the Russian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and the Austrian Empire, with the formation of several countries. For example, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary, and all Poland. Poland disappeared in 1793, divided by Russia, Prussia, and Austria. Well, now Poland's back. And this thing here, see it, Mr. Arlinghouse? This was of particular consternation to the Germans. It is called the Polish Corridor. And you said, and Mr. Allinghouse said, but I thought that was a hallway where everybody walked backwards. No, Mr. Allinghouse. But anyway, yes, this is the Polish Corridor. The purpose of the Polish Corridor was to give the nation of Poland an outlet to the sea. Now, you have to remember that, when they made these map changes, it wasn't, a simple thing. There were lots and lots of German people living here, and those German people had to leave. Uh, the city of Danzig uh, today is called what, Mr. Longhouse? Gdansk. The city of Danzig was to be an international city. And you see, this is brown and this is brown. This is East Prussia. Notice also the states of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia were created here out of Russian territory. And this is the Romania was made part of Russia. The Ottoman Empire became Turkey. In other words, the map was really altered. And so, yeah, good map. Love maps. So there we go. There we are. So, settlement of Europe reflected the collapse of the great defeated empires Russia, the Ottoman Empire, Austria, and Germany. Germany lost part of Silesia, and East Prussia was cut off from the rest of Germany by this thing called the Polish Corridor. Make sure you know what the Polish Corridor is, Mr. Arlinghouse. The Austro-Hungarian Empire disappeared completely, giving way to 5 small so-called, the term they use and will be used going forward, are the successor states. The successor states. What are the successor states? Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and I'm blanking. Most of German-speaking Austria remained in Austrian hands. The Magyars were left with Hungary, and I think I showed you that chart before of the territory that Hungary lost at the end of the war. The Czechs and the Slovaks were joined together in Czechoslovakia, which, first of all, Czechs and Slovaks are both Slavs, but they are different Slavs. And what is amazing is one of the first things that happened after the Soviets were kicked out in 1991 was the Czechs and the Slovaks. Their two countries broke apart. Now there's a Czech Republic and there's a Slovakia. No Czechoslovakia anymore. But Czechoslovakia, as it was created in 1918, included several million Germans who lived in an area in western Czechoslovakia called the Sudetenland. Mr. Arlinghouse, that is a term you want to remember because it'll come up again. The Southern Slavs were united in the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Bosnian Muslims in a country called Yugoslavia. Oh, that was one of the successor states. And this is Yugoslavia. Yeah, that was an idea. The Europeans, the people who wrote up this treaty just thought they could solve everything with a stroke of a pen. And so they throw Serbs, Croats, and Bosnian Muslims together in the same country. Big mistake. Italy gained Trentino and Trieste. Romania was enlarged by receiving Transylvania from Hungary because Hungary lost the war. Yeah, Hungary lost a considerable amount of territory. And Romania was given Bessarabia from Russia. Bulgaria lost territory to Greece, Romania, and Yugoslavia. Russia lost Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland became independent states. Remember that Russia lost territory because it dropped out of the war. Okay, Mr. Arlinghouse. Okay. Why don't we end here, Mr. Arlinghouse, and we're going to finish this chapter tomorrow. That sound good to you? Yeah, I think it does. And so,